Boldwood presents Remember Me, written by Amanda Rigby, and read by Thomas Judd. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Hepworth Preparatory School nestled in 50 acres of rolling hills in the Leicestershire countryside, a bleak collection of red brick buildings that had been patchworked together over time. It had once been a boarding school populated by the underachieving male offspring of the local aristocracy, but in more recent times, and thanks to a recently appointed head teacher, their common entrance exam pass rate had soared, ensuring they'd become the co-ed school of choice in the area. Still bloody cold, though. Despite the daffodils that were covering the far field, Paul Henderson rubbed his hands together and glared at the radiator clinging to the wall for dear life. It was a relic from the Victorian era and served as a stark reminder that, despite all the improvements, funding was an issue. But he couldn't complain. Unlike the sea of teachers who flocked to Hepworth hoping to use it as a springboard to move them up the ladder, Paul had no intention of leaving. For the last 8 months, he'd been acting deputy head, and the Board of Governors would be making his position official in a matter of weeks. And rightly so, since he'd spent countless hours overhauling some of the antiquated, inefficient systems his predecessor had left behind, turning chaos into order. There was a low hum of conversation, and he scanned the room. He'd split his Year 8 class up and given each group a locked box, which had 6 different padlocks on them. The codes for each lock could only be found by solving the problems on the worksheets he'd handed out. In his experience, it managed to engage even the most resistant pupil. He walked around until each group had managed to open their boxes, pride and excitement gleaming on their faces. And they said maths couldn't be fun. They were still discussing the results when the final bell for the morning session cut through the room. Voices rose in the room next door, accompanied by the scraping of chairs, but none of his students stood up. They knew better. He wasn't a strict teacher in the way that some of his colleagues were, but he demanded discipline and made sure his classes knew it. They all waited as he walked back to the desk. "Tonight, I want you to write about 3 things you learned today." "Thought this was meant to be a maths class," someone grumbled from the back. "I could always give you some quadratic equations," Paul suggested, which earned him a laugh. He grinned and waved them off. "Get out of here before I change my mind." They didn't need to be told twice. The class stood, accompanied by the squeal of chair legs being dragged against the cold, tiled floors, and the students spilled out into the corridor. He should bring them back in and make them leave in a more orderly manner, but he didn't. Today was special. Jenna had reached the vital 12-week stage in her pregnancy. She'd had a scare early on when she thought she might be losing the baby, but that had been a false alarm. According to the midwife, everything was progressing well. On the way home, he would stop and collect the gold necklace he'd ordered. It was a simple design with a tiny golden daisy hanging off it. Jenna often said she didn't like flashy jewelry, which was good since his teacher's salary would already be stretched with the arrival of the baby, but he wanted to give her something to let her know how he felt. Meeting Jenna had changed his life. She was smart, funny, sexy, and soon to be the mother of his child. He crossed the courtyard that linked his block to the administration office and almost ran into Tim Barnes, the head teacher, who was flanked by 2 of the school governors. They were all dressed in suits, no doubt on their way to yet another meeting with someone from the Department of Education. "Sorry." He held up his hands by way of an apology. "My fault. We've had someone from the local radio station trying to interview parents," Tim said, running a hand through his thick, dark blonde hair, while the 2 governors looked steely-faced. Paul sighed. It had been like that ever since Eric Chambers, a senior teacher, had been filmed swigging from a vodka bottle by one of the Year 6 girls during the journey to Kim Bolton's school for a netball tournament. The video had quickly found its way to the internet, and the damn thing had gone viral. 2 weeks later, Eric had been suspended, and most of the television crews had disappeared from the front gates, but there was still far too much interest in Hepworth. "You'd think they would have given up by now," Paul said. Tim grunted. "We can only hope. Anyway, we won't keep you. We've got a 1 o'clock. "Of course," Paul said as they hurried off. He continued through to what had been dubbed the new court, a circular garden surrounded by brick buildings propped up by Doric pillars. "Excuse me, sir." One of his pupils appeared from behind him. "Yes, Henry?" He glanced down at the young boy. "I won't be at school next week, and my mother asked if there's any work I should be doing so I don't miss out." Missing school? They normally didn't countenance time off during the term if it could be avoided. "Where are you going?" "Hospital." Henry grimaced. "I'm having my tonsils out." An operation. That explained it. "Don't worry about the work. There'll be plenty of time to catch up. You'll need to rest after." Henry was an excellent student and was earmarked for an academic scholarship at his next school. His parents were driven, and it was typical that they would want him to continue studying even though he'd been in hospital. "Thank you, sir." "I'm surprised you're not having the operation in the school holidays. Or did the doctor want it carried out immediately?" "I can't. We'll be in France." Paul choked back a reply. Considering the parents wanted him to do well, their priorities appeared somewhat misguided. Not that they would place the blame on themselves. They believed that as they paid for their child's education, the onus was on the teaching staff to ensure their child performed to their expectations. Still, Henry was a good kid, and Paul knew better than anyone that you couldn't pick your parents. "I hope it all goes well. I'll see you when you get back. Off you go." Paul sighed and headed for the staff room, where he grabbed himself a coffee and walked to a chair in the corner. It gave him a view of the entire room, yet was away from the hub, which meant he could separate himself from the usual staff room gossip, which inevitably involved venting frustrations at certain pupils. He retrieved his phone and opened up the article he'd been reading on baby buggies. Jenna had been keen for one she could use while jogging, but he wasn't convinced the vibrations would be good for the baby. The research confirmed it. He could just see her teasing smile as she told him he was being overprotective. Guilty as charged. He was going to make sure his child had every advantage in life, everything that he'd never had. He took a sip of coffee and was about to pull out yesterday's tests that still needed marking when a notification blinked up from his social media feed. Nicole Williams. The low chatter of the room fell away, and the light seemed to fade to black as he stared at the screen. Not possible. He pressed on the notification and his ex-fiance's feed flashed up. In the corner was a familiar photo of her. It was one he'd taken in Greece back when they were still together. Back when they'd been in love. Before it all turned to hell. "I've had enough of Australia. I'm back. Can't wait to catch up with all of my old friends." No. That couldn't be right. His pulse thudded in his ears, so loud it gave him a headache. Paul dragged his finger across the screen to refresh it. The message blinked back at him. It had been posted at 12:35. Was this some kind of joke? The room started to spin as a comment flashed up in reply. "About time. It's been 2 years. First round of drinks is on you for clearing off without telling anyone." It was from Barb. Paul vaguely recalled she used to work with Nicole and was a right bitch. A second comment appeared. His mouth was dry and he chugged back the coffee, instantly regretting it as it scalded his throat. Then a third comment. More friends excited at the prospect of seeing Nicole again. Except that was impossible. No one was going to be seeing Nicole again. because she was dead. And he should know, because he was the one who'd killed her. Chapter 2. It was an accident. Of course it was. Paul wasn't evil. He was one of the good guys. 6 years working at Hepworth, spending his spare time refereeing rugby matches and accompanying students on trips, ensuring that every kid who crossed his path knew they were special, that they had potential, that they shouldn't be judged because of past mistakes. And it had all come crashing down thanks to Nicole Williams. No, wait, that wasn't fair. It had been different back then. They'd first met at one of those dreadful university parties. Everyone had been dressed in togas, getting drunk on cheap wine and talking about Voltaire as if they'd been intimately acquainted. It hadn't helped that Paul had come wearing a sheet with a white vest underneath, not ready to display his chest. He hadn't been as fit back then and was self-conscious of his teenage fat. He'd been woefully out of place. Then Nicole had floated in, all long dark hair and even longer legs that were brown from a summer in Norfolk. She was so out of his league that it hadn't occurred to him to talk to her, but a person had bumped her and she'd landed on him, simultaneously sending him crashing to the floor and covering him in wine. Somehow they'd ended up in her apartment. Yes, even as a first year she'd had a flat rather than a crappy dorm room that smelled of cabbage and socks. Instead, an expensive cello was propped up in the corner and the walls were filled with original artwork and a huge bookshelf was bursting with an eclectic range of reading material. Perfect for an art history major. There had also been vodka, the kind that lived in a freezer and was often seen on VIP tables at the London clubs Paul never went to. 3 shots and they discovered they both had a deep and never-ending love of Humphrey Bogart and Casablanca. 5 shots and they both confessed to going naked in public. Nicole's was at a French chateau during a game of strip poker, and Paul's had been while skinny dipping as a 13-year-old. At 7 shots, they realized they were both orphans. In that moment, a bond had formed between them. Born of vodka fumes, but strong enough to last. A secret language of scars, abandonment and trauma that only the two of them could speak. They'd waited 10 years to get engaged, but when they did, Nicole had thrown herself into the planning, including a date at the impossible-to-book church. He hadn't been surprised that she'd managed it. Nicole had always been excellent at getting what she wanted. And getting rid of what she didn't. It was a week before the wedding when he'd found out about the abortion. About how she'd murdered his baby. The wine in his belly had churned, threatening to fight its way back out as a low buzz hummed in his ears. "Don't look at me like that," she'd protested, glossy hair falling round her face as she'd screwed up her mouth the way she did when she didn't get her own way. "I didn't kill anything. You have to see that the timing is all wrong. I'm trying to get my career back on track, and I can't do that in a bloody maternity dress. It wasn't alive. I terminated a pregnancy. It's different." But it wasn't. Not to him. Nicole, out of anyone, should have understood. She knew what his life had been like, what happened to unwanted kids. Hell, she'd been one of those kids too. The buzzing had increased and the room had blurred, like he was pressed behind a plastic bubble, separate from the world. When things came back into focus, everything had changed. He was suddenly standing by the door, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned a terrible blue-white colour. And Nicole was lying sprawled on the floor, the heel of her shoe snapped. How many times had he told her that they were dangerous, that at 5'10" she didn't need to wear heels? There wasn't even any blood, just a tiny purple bruise blooming out against her porcelain skin. He'd run to her, steps heavy and sluggish as he pushed through the invisible waves of energy that pulsed through the room. Vertigo made him sway as he dropped to his knees and checked her pulse, her nose, her mouth. But there was nothing. No. She couldn't be dead. They were meant to have been getting married. His beautiful bride. He should have called the police, an ambulance, anyone. With clumsy hands, he'd snatched up his phone, his chaotic thoughts trying to work out what had happened. Had he pushed her, or had she fallen? That's what the police would ask. What if they didn't believe him? After all, they'd never believed him before, not back then. Police didn't believe people like him. They looked at him and saw what the social workers had seen. You're nobody. Nothing. Heat throbbed in his brow. His life would have been ruined, all because of one mistake. Just like he'd always told his students. One lapse in judgment shouldn't dictate a person's entire future. And so he'd made the decision. He'd taken her to the one place no one would ever look, and he'd buried her deep. It wasn't like in the films. She'd been impossibly heavy to lift despite her slim build, and his muscles stung from the digging. Dirt had been everywhere as he'd rolled her body into the hole. He'd left her in the tight red dress she'd been wearing. It was now ripped and stained, and he'd stripped her of all her jewellery that might identify her. But at the last minute, he'd slipped a gold crucifix round her neck. Neither of them was religious, but Nicole had found it tucked behind a coffee shop sofa and had refused to hand it in. She'd laughed and said that if someone was foolish enough to lose it, they needed to learn a lesson. She'd never worn it, since pious wasn't really her style, but somehow it seemed fitting. Then he'd had to explain to everyone where she'd gone. Thankfully, she'd always used the same password for everything, so he could get into her phone. He'd played the jilted groom. It hadn't been hard. The guilt had formed hard knots in his gut, making eating impossible, while his sleep was filled with nightmares. But now, 2 years later, he had a life he'd never envisaged having. He was happy again. In love. If the truth came out, everything would be ruined. It would make what had happened to Eric Chambers seem like a walk in the park. It wouldn't be just his life. It would affect Jenna and his unborn child, too. His throat tightened and knuckles whitened as he fumbled around in his briefcase for the vial of pills he kept hidden in the lining. He tried not to take them anymore. After all, he was going to be a father. But he knew what happened if he let the pressure build up too much. The 2 pale blue tablets were cradled in the palm of his hand. The pathway to clarity. His hand shook as he swallowed them, chased by a gulp of water. They did nothing to ease his pounding brow, but they would. He willed them to work faster as he tried to focus on his thoughts. There had to be a logical explanation. A hacker or one of her friends had somehow logged in. But why? Was it a coincidence, or did they know something? Either way, he needed to get the post down before anyone else saw it. He entered Nicole's account details and hit enter. A small wheel turned on the screen. Access denied. He tried again, but it was the same. He clicked on the button to reset the password, but the words, "incorrect email address," stared him in the face. He tried to reset the email, but it didn't work. Maybe he should contact the help desk. Did they even have help desks anymore? What if they wanted identification? He rubbed his chin as the bell rang. He let out a shaky breath and put away his phone before heading to his next class. The rest of the afternoon went by with agonizing slowness, an hour teaching and a further hour discussing the maths exam with a colleague. It wasn't until he finally retreated into his office and closed the door that he allowed himself to let go of the forced smile he'd worn. Like everything in Hepworth, The offices were decorated in a traditional style with gold-framed oil paintings and heavy wooden desks, all to radiate the idea of tradition and wealth. Unlike most of the teachers, Paul hadn't added his own touches. There were no potted plants or children's artwork, no personalized coffee cups or mementos. As far as he was concerned, things like that were clutter, distractions, all designed purely to stop someone from doing their core job. All that covered his desk was a computer and his journal, which was filled with meticulous notes. Usually he relished the time after classes to catch up on everything before going home to Jenna, but he couldn't go anywhere until he'd worked out what was going on. He steepled his fingers together. What was he always telling his students? Identify the problem, review what they knew, develop a plan, and then solve it. So, what was the problem? He reached for the journal and began to jot things down. Was it that Nicole was back? No, because that was impossible. He'd seen her broken body, dragged her through the fields, covered her in soil. Nicole was dead. And besides, if she really was still alive, then why had she waited 2 years to come back? It didn't make sense. But it also didn't change the fact that someone had activated her account, which meant someone might know his secret. He'd identified the problem. There was a knock on the door, and he swore as he closed his journal and pushed it to one side. "What?" he said in a sharp voice, his mind still whirling. "I wanted to see if you'd finished for the day." Alison poked her head round the door, a surprised expression on her face. "Am I interrupting?" "No," he said quickly as he took a deep breath. He needed to calm the hell down. Losing control wouldn't help anyone. "Come in." "You sure?" She double-checked, her gaze raking over him. "Yes." He nodded as she finally stepped into the room. They'd both started at Hepworth in the same term and had become friends. At first sharing a pint while coming up with strategies to control classrooms and get parents on side. But after he'd found her in the school car park being groped by another teacher and he'd managed to pull the prick off her, their friendship had deepened. Over the years, they'd been there for each other. She'd been a shoulder to cry on when Nicole had left, and he'd been a friend to her after her long-term partner, Rob, had taken a job on the Isle of Wight and not asked her to go with him. Alison awkwardly dropped into one of the leather chairs that were designed to remind parents why they spent so much money sending their kids to the school. She had long legs, made strong from years of horse riding. Her mouth was wide and firm, eyes like amber chips, and dark hair that was currently filled with highlights. Jenna often said that Alison was attractive, but to Paul she was simply one of the few people in the world whom he could trust. Her brows knitted together. "You look pale. Has something happened to Jenna?" "The morning sickness has been brutal, but the books all say that'll ease soon." He forced a smile. She was the only person he'd confided in about the pregnancy, but even then they didn't discuss it much. "We've hit the 12-week mark today, which hopefully means she won't miscarry." Understanding lit her eyes. "Ah, that's why you were looking so distracted." "Not exactly." "I don't want to jinx anything." "You won't, idiot. It's going to be fine." She rummaged through her bag, withdrawing a bag of crisps. She opened it up and offered him one. He shook his head. She'd always been able to eat whatever she wanted and remain slim, which was a source of envy to many of their colleagues, who often passed comment on it. "Are you going to start telling people?" "I think so." Jenna's family would be thrilled, but as for him, he had no one to tell. His parents had died in a car crash when he was 8, and the foster family he'd been placed in 6 months later had sent him back to Arlington, a hellhole of a residential home in Bradford, after a year. He doubted they even remembered who he was, let alone gave a shit about his life. That makes sense. Alison grabbed a handful of crisps from the packet. Plus, it means I'll finally be able to go shopping. I've wanted to buy things from the moment you told me. Al, it's still too early, he said, familiar dread gathering in his gut. He'd assumed he would be worried about his child from the moment it was born, but it had happened as soon as Jenna had greeted him at the door, clutching the pregnancy test, with tears of joy glistening in her eyes. Fine, I'll wait a bit longer, Alison conceded before catching his gaze. But you need to stop worrying. You and Jenna are going to be amazing parents. Thanks, he said as she tugged at the heavy gold signet ring on her index finger. It was a tell of hers, one she used whenever she felt nervous or uncomfortable, but usually she only reserved it for people she didn't know very well, which meant hell. She'd seen the post. He rolled his neck, trying to ease the building pressure. Is that why you're really here? He finally spoke. To see if I knew about Nicole. A guilty flush rose up her neck and she let out a long sigh. I was hoping you hadn't seen it, she admitted, searching his face for clues. He swallowed. What kind of clues did she want to see? That he was on edge that his ex might be back in the country, or that he was so blissfully happy with Jenna that Nicole's appearance meant nothing to him? Or both? He finally settled on the latter. That makes two of us, he said, careful to keep his voice even. Did you have any idea she was coming back? She sounded cautious, like an archaeologist carefully brushing away soil, not sure what was going to be underneath. God, no. Paul shook his head. At least this was one reaction he didn't have to fake. How about you? No, I don't tend to read her posts. Not after what she did to you, she said, once again twisting the ring on her finger. She sucked in a breath and studied him, as if weighing up her words. Then she gave him a cautious smile. You never really talk about the night she walked out on you, but I know it ended badly. So, how are you feeling? Paul raked a hand through his hair and turned away. What a bloody mess. How was he meant to answer her? Tell her the truth? That whoever this was, it wasn't Nicole? Tell her that he was scared shitless because someone knew what he'd done and that they could ruin his life at the drop of a hat? Except it was bad enough that one person knew what had happened. He could hardly tell Alison as well. I feel indifferent, he said at last. My future's with Jenna and the baby. I have no desire to ever see Nicole again. Alison let out a breath, as if relieved he'd given her the right answer. He couldn't blame her. From her point of view, she'd supported him through a devastating breakup, and he doubted she was in a hurry to do it again. Good. I'm glad to hear it. After what she did to you, leaving you for a job. She trailed off, as if not wanting to remind him about what had happened when Nicole had suddenly packed her bags and headed to Australia to take a new position. He swallowed. That part had been almost true. After her bohemian days at university, when she'd devoured her art history, Nicole had done a full pivot and trained to become an accountant. She was a high flyer and had worked her way up to being a chief financial officer in less than a decade. But she'd lost her job several months before the accident. It wasn't until afterwards Paul discovered an offer letter from an Australasian company to move to their Sydney office. He'd known nothing about it. The second secret she kept from me. Not that what he'd done was justified. He knew that better than anyone. He'd paid for it for a long time. Every night he'd wake up from blood-soaked dreams, guilt clinging to him like heavy roots, trying to drag him down into the same dirt grave he'd dug for Nicole. He'd walked around for months with bags under his eyes and shoulders weighed down with leaden weights. No more than what he deserved, he'd tell himself. It hadn't been hard to act the poor, devastated fiancé. It was a role he'd expected to play for the rest of his life. Then he'd met Jenna, the woman who gave him a reason to live again. The buzz of Alison's phone cut through his thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Shit, I'm meant to be in the hall. I'm still covering Eric's science club. What a mess. At least the press are leaving us alone now. I can't believe none of us knew Eric had been coming to work drunk every day for the last 4 years. Still, I guess it's good it happened. Good? Paul blinked, momentarily pushing his thoughts of Nicole aside. The whole school's been plunged into a scandal. How is that good? Alison coloured. That came out wrong. I meant that he has a wife and kids, and at least now his secret's out, he can start getting the help he needs. We all have to face our demons sooner or later. This way, he might actually save his marriage as well. I suppose, he said as her alarm went for a second time. He made a shooing motion with his hands and plastered on a smile. You better go, but I'll see you Monday. Have a good weekend. I will, she said, leaving his office and heading in the direction of the hall. Paul rubbed the tight spot at the back of his neck as he picked up his phone again. The post was still there. It now had 15 new comments. And hell, next to each entry was a reply. The air pushed out of his lungs. Can't wait to see you too, Gigi. And you better bring along that perfect husband of yours. I still think about your wedding day. So great. Debs, we are going to party so hard. Tabby Cat, I hope that great jazz club we discovered on the King's Road is still there. On and on the comments went. Nicole's friends from work and university, and each one was individually answered. Despite the amphetamines, his brow began to pound again, and this time he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, where his predecessor had left a bottle of gin. Not Paul's drink of choice, which was why he'd hidden it from sight. There was an empty coffee cup on his desk, and he poured in 2 fingers of alcohol. Not enough to make him drunk or stop him from driving home, just enough to give him some relief from the 2 questions burning through his brain. Who was doing this? And what did they want? Chapter 3. 3 Holloway Drive wasn't the kind of place Jenna ever envisaged herself living in. For a start, it was on one of those estates where all the houses looked the same, but the residents prided themselves on how different they were because of their unique brass taps and brightly coloured splashbacks. No. In her mind, she was going to live in a tiny cottage with 18th century ceiling beams that were too low for the room, but so full of history and stories that one didn't mind the eccentric quirks. She would have chickens in the garden and a riot of spring flowers growing everywhere. Paul's house was none of those things. He'd bought it straight off the plan after Nicole had fallen in love with it. Not in love enough to buy it with him, though, which is why he still lived there. While it was lovely to have a clean bathroom and bedrooms that didn't get covered in mould or a chimney that coughed clouds of smoke into the room, it wasn't quite how Jenna imagined raising her children. Then again, she'd never imagined having children with anyone like Paul. Not because she didn't love him. Rather, it was the opposite. People like Paul didn't usually notice women like her. That's why she'd wanted the cottage, so it could be a prop to make her interesting, desirable, visible. Oh yes, people would say, Jenna Reynolds lives in that marvellous cottage. It's quite extraordinary how she keeps the garden so beautiful while taking care of the twins and working full-time. What an absolute diamond. But somehow, even without the cottage, Paul had seen her, in a way that the rest of the world had not. And so when he'd first suggested she move in with him, it didn't occur to her to say she didn't like modern houses or sleek kitchen counters. After all, she had Paul, which meant she no longer needed anything else. She drained the glistening parcels of ravioli, watching as they slithered about like freshly caught fish. She'd made the pasta sheets herself and stuffed them with Paul's favourite portobello mushrooms and blue cheese, all to celebrate the good news. Not that she'd be able to eat it. She hadn't been able to keep down more than a few pieces of dry toast and weak tea since she'd conceived. Still, the doctor said she'd soon start feeling better. Even if it lasted the entire pregnancy, she didn't care. They were having a baby. She finished with the pasta and reached for the crushed tomato sauce she'd made, timed to be ready for when Paul walked in the door. Except that had been 10 minutes ago. The joys of living with a teacher. At Hepworth, there was always a chance he'd be late, dragged into some last-minute meeting or other, but usually when that happened, he'd call or text. Unless he was stopping to get something with which to celebrate. The smile she'd been wearing all day returned. Her phone buzzed and she eagerly snatched it up, expecting to see Paul's name on the screen, but it was her older sister, Lucy. Jenna pressed her lips together. She wanted to answer, especially now that she was past the 12-week mark and could officially tell her family about the pregnancy. But to do that might also raise the question she'd been dreading. When are you getting married? It was the only fracture in her otherwise perfect relationship. It was something she longed for. After all, Lucy had tied the knot 5 years ago to her childhood sweetheart, while next week their parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Then there's me. Both her mother and Lucy were tall and slim, with ebony hair and matching almond-shaped eyes, always immaculately groomed and calm under pressure. Unlike Jenna, who was small, with a spare tire round her waist and auburn hair that had a tendency to frizz. She was the complete opposite of her family. And of Paul's ex-fiance, Nicole. Jenna gnawed on her lower lip. Nicole was the woman who'd walked out on Paul a week before their gigantic wedding. The wedding that had left him humiliated and unanchored. The wedding that had turned him off marriage for life. She did understand, but unfortunately her sister didn't, and Lucy had taken to making little digs at Paul whenever she could. This forced Jenna to constantly juggle her family and Paul, trying to keep them both happy, while at the same time wondering if it was so wrong that she wanted the same thing everyone else had. Her phone rang again, but she ignored it, not ready for another argument. She'd have to tell her family at some stage about the baby. She just needed a little bit more time. The familiar beep of the garage door opening up dragged her back to reality, and Jenna smoothed down her skirt as the car door closed. Tap, shuffle, scuff, as Paul walked across the concrete floor, past the neatly stored gardening tools, the emergency chest freezer, and her own little car. Click, click, as he turned off the garage lights and simultaneously locked his car, and then he was in the hallway. Oh, how she loved the sounds of him moving round the house with his methodical, careful steps. Warmth cocooned her. "I'm in the kitchen," she called out, even though the clip, clip, clip of his leather brogues told her he was coming to find her. She bit down on her lip as she gave the ravioli one final inspection. Until she'd met Paul, her cooking skills had consisted of boiling an egg and making jacket potatoes. But when she'd discovered that Nicole, as well as being beautiful, successful and smart, had been known for her famous dinner parties, Jenna realized her days of eating like a broke student were over, and she'd spent their first 2 months secretly watching as many YouTube cooking tutorials as she could. If the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, then she was going to pave the road in Instagram-ready creations. He stepped in and smiled, his gaze first sweeping across her face and then drifting down to her stomach. His dark hair was tousled from the blustery May winds outside, but his mouth was warm on her neck as he wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned back into the press of his body. His breath fanned her skin and familiar heat spread through her. Sometimes she still had to pinch herself that he was hers. They'd met 18 months ago when he'd attended a suicide prevention seminar she'd arranged. She'd trained as a social worker, but now worked at a charity where she did everything from fundraising through to event planning. She'd been standing at the back listening to the speaker when he charged in, late. He glanced at her, and she shushed him with her finger on her lips. He'd given her the most contrite smile and stood beside her until the first break, when he could take his seat. But not before he'd suggested they sit together for lunch after the morning session. It was like they'd known each other forever. He was so handsome, with thick brown hair, wide blue eyes, and a chin dimple that endlessly fascinated her. When he'd called the next day to ask her out on an official date, she'd almost wept with delight. "Something smells good." He spun her round and kissed her. His mouth tasted of breath mints and coffee and was soft against hers. "I thought we'd agreed you would take it easy, especially when you can't even eat it." "Did I not tell you about the foot massage you'll be giving me later?" she said in a teasing voice, but instead of giving her one of his lazy smiles, his mouth puckered into a frown. A moment later it was gone. "If it's a foot massage you want, then a foot massage you shall have." He planted another kiss on her forehead before untangling himself and walking to the fridge. He pulled out a bottle of beer and then stiffened and put it back. Jenna winced. He'd declared that if she couldn't drink during the pregnancy, then neither would he. Not that he ever drank that much anyway. "Everything okay?" she asked. His shoulders dropped and he gave her a rueful smile. "I really need to work on my poker face," he said with a sigh. "It's nothing much, just a busy day at work and bloody parents pulling their kids out of school because they don't want to miss out on a trip to France. God, I hope I'm not that kind of father." "Impossible," she said. And it was true. Paul was brilliant with children, from the students he taught through to the neighbourhood kids who usually cajoled him into a game of football every Sunday afternoon at the nearby park. "You'll be amazing." "As will you. Speaking of which, I got you something to celebrate the 3-month mark." He rummaged round in his pocket and withdrew a small black velvet case. Jenna's mouth went dry. A jewellery box. A ring-sized jewellery box. "Paul!" She let out a soft gasp and stepped back. But he didn't drop down onto one knee. He simply handed her the box. Ice washed over her. It wasn't a proposal. It was silly of her to even think it. "Go on, open it." He grinned like an excited child who'd bought someone a present for the first time. She swallowed, pleased he hadn't realized her mistake. Her hands shook from embarrassment as she flipped open the box to reveal a delicate gold chain with a tiny charm at the end of it. A daisy, her favourite flower. "Oh, thank you. I love it." "Really?" he said, eyeing her uncertainly. Sometimes she forgot that underneath his affable, confident veneer there was a vulnerability to him, a fear of being rejected. She guessed it came from losing his parents at such a young age and growing up as an orphan, and she hated that it had left such a scar. And so she swallowed back her own disappointment, pushed down the image of another woman standing in the kitchen, receiving another small jewellery box. A tall, beautiful woman with long, dark hair. And when that woman had opened the box, there had been a ring. "It's perfect, truly," she assured him. "My neck is probably the only part of my body that isn't swollen, so it might even fit." "You're beautiful," he said in a fierce voice as the panic left his eyes. "Here, let me put it on." He took the box and nodded for her to turn round. He leaned into her, his breath hot against her skin as he gently slid the necklace round her throat and fiddled with the clasp. When he was done, he wrapped his arms round her stomach. She was usually self-conscious of the soft swell of extra flesh, but now she had a legitimate reason for her lack of washboard abs. She didn't mind. They stayed like that, gently rocking together, his warmth running through her skin and down her veins like a river. It wasn't until the timer pinged that she reluctantly untangled herself and pressed her mouth to his. "Go and get changed. Dinner's nearly ready," she said as the kitchen filled with the scent of buttery garlic bread. She swallowed back her own nausea. "No idea what I did to deserve you, but I'm bloody glad it worked." He headed to the door, picking up the post as he went. She never received much mail, just the occasional catalogue or the annual birthday card from her elderly grandparents. But Paul got a small collection of bank statements and doctor's reminders. She'd been trying to ease him into the digital world and stop receiving so much paper, but so far it hadn't been a success. Still, considering they had a hybrid car and always recycled, they were ahead with their carbon footprint. He returned 5 minutes later, and once they'd eaten, he shooed her into the lounge while he dealt with the dishes. The low buzz of Radio 2 kept him company as Jenna sat down on the sofa. It was a dull beige colour that reminded her of oatmeal, but was apparently Italian linen, and according to Paul, it cost more than his car. Nicole had been the one to pick it. Had it been his ex's revenge? To make sure that any woman who tried to take her place would feel uncomfortable in the room that had once been hers? If so, it had worked perfectly, and Jenna couldn't even bring herself to kick off her shoes and curl up her feet on the expensive piece of furniture. She wriggled about, trying to get settled before firing up her laptop. Paul would probably scold her for working too hard, but she had a funding application to finish. They needed a grant to roll out the new school program they'd spent the last 6 months developing. So far, the results had been astounding, and every life saved made the hard work worthwhile. Paul reappeared in the doorway, his brow glistened from standing over a sink full of hot water. In his hands were 2 mugs, and he passed her one and then slipped her phone out of his pocket. "I brought this in. You've 2 missed calls from Lucy. Let me guess, now that your perfect sister knows about the baby, she wants to keep checking up on you." Jenna stiffened and then caught herself. They'd agreed that they wouldn't tell anyone until they'd hit the 12-week mark, which meant Paul had assumed her family now knew the happy news. They would. Soon. It also filled her with annoyance that Lucy distrusted Paul merely because he hadn't proposed, yet Paul seemed to take her sister's constant needling with good humour and kindness. "Must be." She took the phone and studied the screen, as if seeing the messages for the first time. "Probably wants to talk about vitamins." His eyes filled with concern. "Don't commit to taking anything until we check them out properly first. There are so many out there that are filled with additives." "I promise," she said, her fingers reaching up to touch the delicate necklace now round her throat. Most of the time, she wasn't really sure why Paul had chosen her, but she had to remind herself that it didn't really matter anyway. All that mattered was he had, and that they were about to have a baby. It might not have been enough for Nicole or Lucy, but it was enough for her. Chapter 4. There was always one. In this instance, it was Jeremy Lewis. The 12-year-old boy had decided to climb up onto the roof of the sports shed, via an apple tree, to retrieve his football. Unfortunately, he hadn't considered how he would get down, and the kid was now sitting there, his face almost as white as the ball he was hugging. Paul turned to the ancient groundsman who was clutching at the ladder with arthritic fingers. He had to be at least 80 and had more chance of running a marathon than climbing up the rungs. Sunshine had appeared and brought with it an audience of boys, all hollering with excitement. Paul gave them a quelling look, not for the first time wondering how kids could go so wild as soon as they were in the playground. He sighed and rolled up his sleeves. Maybe the board would offer him a pay rise when they finally made his title official. The groundsman tutted his tongue and held the bottom of the ladder as Paul climbed up and leaned over the guttering. "I'm sure the views are nice up here, Jeremy, but it's probably time to come down."
"I can't, sir. I feel sick. What if I puke?"
"Then we'll both be raiding lost property for something else to wear," Paul said in a matter-of-fact voice as he swung himself onto the roof. It had a high rake, and the shingles were covered in lichen and moss. He held out his hand. "Let's get rid of the ball and we'll go down together, okay?" Jeremy chewed on his lip but didn't protest as Paul plucked the ball from his hands and threw it down into the crowd of hovering students. They all hooted, and one of them kicked it away. Several of the kids followed it, and as the audience dispersed, Jeremy's shoulders relaxed. "See, that wasn't too hard. Now, I'll go first and you follow. That way, if you fall, at least you'll land on me." This drew a laugh, and some of the colour returned to the lad's face. Then he pointed to Paul's outstretched arm.
"What's that?"
Paul's jaw flickered, and he resisted the urge to look at the 10-inch burn scar that ran from his left wrist up to his elbow. In winter, it often went an angry purple colour, but in the milder weather it was a dull red. It was also why he usually preferred to keep his sleeves down. "Nothing much. I had an argument with a barbed wire fence. As you can see, I lost," he said in the same light voice he always used. Calm, controlled. "Nothing to see here, folks." "Let's get you down." Jeremy swallowed as if considering, then nodded. "Don't let me fall." "I won't," Paul promised as he swung his own legs back down onto the top rung. He climbed down 2 steps and held out a hand for Jeremy to cling onto. The scared boy shuffled along the roof until he reached the ladder. Then he put a tentative foot onto the first rung, while Paul put an arm round him to keep him steady. Rung by rung they went until they reached the ground. Jeremy turned to him.
"Am I in trouble, sir?"
"I'll need to tell your parents, and we'll have to write up an incident report. But I'm sure it isn't something you'll be doing again in a hurry," he said, making light of the fallout Jeremy's adventure would entail.
"No way,"
Jeremy agreed before running over to where a group of boys were waiting for him. Paul yawned and pulled his phone out of his pocket.